History Hour podcast. This is Bethany, Evan, Kris, and Kaleb, your hosts.
Hi. Hello. Hello.
We are all members of the University of Maine at Presque Isle History Club, and we are broadcasting from the WUPI 92.1 FM in Presque Isle. This is the show for all the curious and those attracted by history and fascinating stories. And on this episode of our podcast series, we will be discussing the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination.
With us today, we also have a very special guest, adjunct instructor of history, Don Cyr, here at the University of Maine at Presque Isle. Well, welcome to our show.
Thank you. I've been teaching here since 1980.
Good.
So it's a fairly good number of years. And I live up in the little village of Lille in the St. John Valley. And I'm the president of the Association Culturelle et Historique du Mont-Carmel, which is a cultural and historical society based in Lille. And we're restoring a former Catholic church. It's a museum. It's from the village. Lille and Grand Isle are two villages next to each other, and they're two churches 3 miles apart. And the area has lost about 80% of its population, mainly due to the fact that family size has gone from between 10 and 20 children to 1 and 2 children. And so the result is they didn't need two large churches. And so they closed one down. And it's a historic building. It's on the National Register. And we've been restoring it since 1983.
And I've been, personally, I've been to the church and the all of the events that you guys do there, and it's a great job.
Thank you.
So let us begin this conversation with our topic. So as Bethany said, our title was The Doctrine of Christian Discovery and Domination. And that's, of course, if you see it from the first time, it's like a heavy title. Like, what does it mean? Like, you go back to the background of it. So let's begin the conversation with the first piece of the puzzle, which is, so when we say Christian discovery and domination, of course, we talk about the colonization of the Americas, right?
Yep.
We talk about, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the English, primarily up here in the New England, coming and colonizing.
But the first were French.
The French, of course, yeah, in the St. John
But
Valley.
they were here first.
Before the
before
British.
the English.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So that first piece of the puzzle, I believe, will be the crossing of what they call the Big River, which is the Atlantic Ocean. So I guess we'll start with a very simple concept. So why did the Europeans cross here, how they did it, and what were some of the motives? Would you like to give us your perspective on it?
For the French perspective is very different from the English perspective, as it would be, and as it probably should be, because the French and English have been enemies since 1066, and will remain so up until, in the mid-19th century. So the French purposefully settled the area in order to colonize and establish trade with the natives. And the reason for that was Samuel Champlain was a navigator on the first voyage over in 1604, and they settled near Calais in an island in the middle of the St. Croix River, but only lasted 1 year there because it was a freshwater river going into a saltwater bay with 30-foot tides. So once they're on the island, they can't get off in the winter. And so they went to Nova Scotia the next year in 1605. And Champlain ended up going back to France and then founding Quebec. So in North America, you had 3 French colonies called New France. There's Acadia, the first one, Quebec, the larger one, and Louisiana. And they controlled all of the interior part of the continent. And mainly because they had native allies. And in Champlain, that was due to that was really Champlain's idea. He had been sent as a spy to visit the Spanish settlements and came back and told the king that the Spanish made the mistake of enslaving the natives and bringing slavery in from Africa, and that has stifled their colony. That was better to trade with the natives. And so that was the plan, the French plan. They had contact with the natives since the 1520s. because they were sending fishing fleets over to fish on the Grand Banks off Newfoundland and off the Maritime provinces and in the Gulf of Maine, and taking fish back. In 1607, there was one French fisherman who said that he had just finished his 42nd annual voyage to North America. He'd been here 42 times before 1607.
Oh, traveling.
But I mean, it means 1565 is the earliest.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, not the earliest, the latest he could have done it, because he couldn't make 2 trips in 1 year. And what they did is they started trade with the natives, and they worked. Champlain was a kind of an anthropologist, an amateur anthropologist, very interested in native mores and that kind of thing. And so they decided to set up their trade with the natives the native way, and which is not really trading but gifting back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
And when you gift back and forth, you're allies. And when you're allies, that means if one goes to war, you all go to war. Okay? And they were also Christianized. All the natives have became Roman Catholic by 1610. So again, that's 10 years before the Pilgrims
Totally, yeah.
arrived.
Yeah.
Okay? And so that was part of the plan. And they also intermarried because the first wave of Acadian settlers, are not really settlers, they're really soldiers, intermarried with natives. And it isn't until the 1630s that families start coming over. But by then, it's all established on fishing and on the fur trade. And they traded 25,000 pelts in Port Royal, Nova Scotia. It was Acadia, now it's Nova Scotia. 25,000 pelts in 1 year. And so they're trading with natives on river systems. So obviously a lot of these pelts came from the St. John River system, which is a huge watershed. And so when you talk about domination, Christian domination, everyone in the region was Roman Catholic.
Absolutely, yeah, because
Yeah.
and everybody did it with their own ways. The French, as you said, they become closer with the natives. Then you have the Pilgrims. The natives are evil in their eyes, and you have this. It's a lot of patterns that go with that same concept.
Absolutely.
So the doctrine of this. So we're talking about domination and discovery. So I think it will be very wise to talk about the doctrine of discovery, which was established again as a spiritual, political, and at sometimes legal justification for colonizing and taking the lands by the people that inhabit it were not Christians. And if I'm not mistaken, that document was invoked by Pope Alexander VI in 1493, which we're talking about very early over here. And that papal decree aimed to justify all the Christian European explorers and their claims in the new land. So an explorer, a Christian explorer from Europe, can come to these lands, just put down a flag, go back, claim the land, then come back and just own it in the name of the king or the queen or whatever that concept was. And based on that doctrine, he had the right to do whatever he wanted with the inhabitants that were not Christians, and also the land and all the other claims. So we're talking about a very particular piece of history that in my opinion, describes all of what we've been as a nation from the beginning till now.
Pretty much, yeah.
And the French had the best relationship with the natives of the European powers, but even they had their prejudices against the natives. Number one, it's always French men marrying native women, never French women marrying native men, and because they put their women on a pedestal, for one thing, and the other thing too is the tribal chief got a gorget, and a gorget is a big silver medallion with Louis XIV on it, because Louis XIV, of course, was king through most of the early settlement of New France. I mean, he was king for 72 years. And so from Louis XIV's point of view, seeing that gorget on that native tribe means that that native tribe is subject to him. But the native chiefs saw that gorget as they being his equal. And he never spoke to them, and of course they never spoke to him because he's across the ocean. So
Absolutely.
it seemed to work pretty well. But the idea that the natives were a bit less was still predominant among the French.
And that is a great point, because with that document you have a dehumanization of everybody non-Christian. And I think, I mean, you know, like the church kind of pushed it to, you know, like trying to justify all of these actions. They did not go against any of those actions. And we know, again, we have the French right in this area and in Louisiana, as you said. The British will come later, and then you have the more brutal Spanish and
Yeah, of course.
on the
When,
south.
and when I say this, and now when I said the French were first, I was not talking about the Spanish. I was not including them in, on that part of the
They
conversation.
were pretty early as
because
well.
they're,
yeah,
they're
yeah.
100 years earlier,
Yeah.
obviously. But I'm just talking about in this region.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah.
And in fact, in the U.S. and Canada, it would be that would be the case.
Totally, yeah.
Well, with the Spanish, you don't even think about them coming to North America. You think of, oh, it's South America, Caribbean.
Florida.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
Except that Mexico and Central America are all part of North America.
Yeah.
Definitely.
But we tend not to think of it that way.
You just think about what they did in South America, and that's really that's the most famous of their
It's what comes
exploits.
to mind.
Yeah.
So yeah, and again, you see with doctrines like this, you have the Europeans coming over, and their tactic is not about, okay, I'm gonna go and get all of the stuff. It's kind of like the I don't know what was the concept with the Monroe Doctrine and the
That-
destiny that America had to expand west, kind of like that
That's
feeling.
all very much later.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
when the English are controlling most of the continent. That's after 1763, for
But
sure.
I was thinking that it's kind of like the same idea that
Oh, absolutely.
because of that,
They're
like
leading
I
to each
have the
other.
right, because of these things that happen to do whatever I want, which is kind of like
It's probably because that God is like
about to say it's like
yeah.
a God-given right. Yeah, that's how
The-
they felt.
The figurehead of the thing everyone wants to be a part of said this is fine, therefore I won't get in trouble for this. Who would be upset with me?
exactly. I mean, you have the justification from the Pope himself, so who can
And
stop you at that
who's
point?
going to argue with
But
that?
there are a whole group that are not listening to the Pope.
Of
And
course.
those would be the English settlers.
yeah.
And so the Pope isn't in the picture there at all.
Right.
They come for their religious freedom.
Yeah.
Notice I didn't say religious freedom.
yeah.
They came for their religious freedom.
Not the natives. Not
no,
the natives.
not the natives or
That-
not any
yeah.
other Protestant.
Or
Yeah.
the French.
No, yeah,
They
Yeah.
were the
No,
Puritans.
really,
They were
yes.
pure. They were building this city on a hill. They used to, where they like to think of it as,
Yeah.
is they were purer than the Puritans in England. Of course, in England, they thought they were purer than the Puritans in America. But no religious freedom there whatsoever.
Yeah.
If you varied from the belief, then you were
Very much of the
banished.
absence of
Which is
religious
why we have other
separation.
states in New England.
Right.
Absolutely, yeah.
You are-
Exactly.
You are free as long as you are exactly like us.
Right.
Exactly. That's not freedom, is it?
Yeah.
Not
No.
the slightest.
And again, because of that, I think motive, that's why we have a lot of what we have today. Those, even I want to see it as even that today, how the majority of us faces the native populations and the native reserves. I believe it's not really far from what happened back then. I mean, in some ways, of course, not in any like genocide kind of way, but I think it all started at that point.
Well, there is genocide in the West, that's for sure.
That yes.
They did what they could to wipe out as
Even
many-
here in
in Maine,
Connecticut too.
In Maine,
Yeah.
In
New
Maine,
England.
absolutely.
Yeah, and when I say in Maine, I'm talking about south of the Kennebec River.
Yeah.
Because north and
Portland,
east of the
Paris.
Kennebec River, it was French territory, and the natives were their partners. The French and the natives together were raiding the English colonies. In King William's War, they emptied Maine of its population, except for 4 little towns near Kittery. and the people escaped to Massachusetts.
Was that during the French and Indian War, or was that way
That's
later?
That's later.
Yeah.
There were 4 wars. There was
Yeah.
King William's War, there's Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and the 7 Years' War, which we call the French and Indian
Yeah.
War.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that would have been the last one. So the first one is in the 1690s, and the last one is settled in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and going, of course, to follow our topic, and as you said, Maine, I think it's the right time to focus in a little bit of this part of New England, because it's so much going on at this time. So I wanted to refer to the Phips Bounty Proclamation, and what was the other name that you said previously for the Phips Bounty Proclamation?
That's really the one that allowed scalping,
Yeah, the
because
scalp.
they're putting bounty on native scalps. But that was in what was called Maine then was the Gorges Grant,
Mhm.
and that's really down in the Portland area south. It's
And of
really-
course, it was part of the Massachusetts.
it was part of Massachusetts.
Yeah.
But the difference between Maine and Massachusetts is the people of Maine tended to be Church of England rather than Puritan. And that was a big difference.
Mhm.
So that will cause
Yeah.
problems for Maine. In the people of Maine felt about Massachusetts the way the people of Aroostook County feel about Maine. They feel they feel left
Southern
out.
Maine. Yeah,
Yeah, they
Yeah,
feel left
right.
out. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
This is
So-
North Canada, not Maine.
Yeah.
Right. Well, in these wars, when Maine was emptied of its population, they weren't being protected by Massachusetts. Massachusetts sent no aid.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because they had nothing, to
Yeah.
do on it.
Exactly.
So going back on the Phips Bounty Proclamation, and for our listeners that don't know what that was, so back in 1749, in Wiscasset Harbor, 6 Englishmen killed a Wabanaki man and wounded 2 others. No one was convicted of the murder, and incidents of violence between Wabanaki people and colonial settlers, of course, followed after that. Now, following a few years after that, in 1755, Spencer Phipps, who was a lieutenant governor for the province of Massachusetts, issued this proclamation that we're talking about, that declared that all the Penobscot people were enemies, rebels, and traitors to King George II, and called on all His Majesty's subjects of the province to embrace every opportunity they could find to pursue, captivate, kill, and destroy all and every of the natives that were part of the tribe.
At the same time, the same people were deporting the Acadians from Acadia in 1755.
From
and taking Nova, and they of course they'd conquered Acadia in 1710.
Yeah.
And the Acadians had lived under English rule, and they wanted to have an oath of allegiance, and the Acadians refused to do that. They said they would take an oath of neutrality because they knew that they might be used as cannon fodder to capture Quebec, and they didn't want to have to go against their French brethren, and so they weren't told, of course, that no Roman Catholic could be in the British Army. They weren't told that. If they would have been told that, it would have made a big difference because they would have been disqualified from being in the army. But they were deported to all the colonies, the British colonies in America, and it was between 1755 and 1763. And in 1763, with the Treaty of Paris, France gives up all of its, all of Canada and Acadia in exchange for Guadeloupe and Martinique in the Caribbean. 2 little islands in the Caribbean that were sugar islands that made 4 times the money that all of New France made.
Makes sense.
Wow. Yeah.
Nailed that deal.
So, okay, now I'm going into a different thing, and you guys feel free to jump in. We see that the English, of course, and from these examples, like this bounty, the Phips Bounty Proclamation, the Acadians, we see that the British, or I should say the Pilgrims,
It would be the British
British,
up until 1783,
of course,
when
yeah.
America was when the
So-
U.S. was formed.
Then America jumped right in and it's like, hey, we'll continue what the British did.
They had such a harsh politic against anybody that were not them.
Yeah.
With the French, again, as we said, were there any instances that they did that, or it was just all, like we said, trade and intermarriage?
It was trade and intermarriage, and of course they were all Roman Catholic, which helped. But in Quebec, when Champlain arrived in Quebec, he had to make a choice of who he was going to be allied with. The Algonquin-related tribes along the St. Lawrence River, or the Iroquois tribes further up the river and around the Great Lakes. And the Algonquin and the Iroquois were enemies, and so he chose to be enemies with them, and he led a battle against the Iroquois in full armor with a big blunderbuss.
For nowadays, it's called Six Nations.
Yeah. And so in Quebec it was a different story. There were Iroquois raids and things like that. There's one story in Quebec of a 14-year-old girl holding off a tribe of Iroquois natives.
Wow.
Yeah, they were attacking a house, and she was the only one. She was the only one that survived, and she had rifles stationed at all these windows, and she's going around from one to one, and she was able to single-handedly scare them off.
So mind games, essentially.
Which is pretty, and I'm sure that story's become exaggerated with time. But it's still remarkable.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
With stories like that, there must be some truth to it, at least. So.
A little bit.
Yeah.
A little bit. But again, there's a political agenda there.
Yeah.
That Europeans are
they won't give up
a little bit more elevated.
I was going to say, it's probably the exaggerated truth.
Yeah.
So again, and we don't want to spend too much time because we can go on and on about what happened, and I think Bethany has more of that information. And what were some of the consequences of that idea of Christian discovery and domination? Because I know we've talked about, and we can again rephrase it again and talk about it again, about what happened to the natives after that, after all of this settling.
French settlement. So I think Professor Cyr touched on that, but the residential schools was a big thing. You got, well, other than forcibly being put into residential schools and becoming Roman Catholic, you have people's names changing. They lost their complete identity with that. So
There's just a little bit more to that.
Go ahead, yeah.
That whole residential school movement was initiated by the government, and religions were forced to lead those schools, and so there were Protestant ones as well.
Yes, of course.
So it wasn't just the Catholic Church, but they were forced to do that.
Right, my grandma went to a Protestant residential school, so.
So yeah, Bethany, talk about your own background as well, like what do you have to do with all of this?
What do I have to do with all of this? So, oh my gosh, all right, I'm put on the spot, but so I'm technically, I'll mention both my tribes, but I'm Mashpee, Wampanoag, and Micmac from Prince Edward Island. And sorry for all of you Mi'kmaq. So yeah, I have stories in my family about my grandma being in residential school and her marrying a white man, which was a big no-no because then she lost her Indian status. Yeah, she lost her status.
Connection status. Yeah.
Status. Yeah, I don't know how much more to elaborate on that.
I mean, but, you feel what this is about, so that's why.
You heard the stories, you know what you went through.
Yeah.
That's why I ask you to say on that. Yeah.
But the brutality of it is the fact that here they are, native families. These children are taken away and put in schools, and these children are forbidden to speak their language. They cut their hair.
Right.
So they're trying to make white people out of these natives, is what they're trying to do.
I can touch a little bit on, because I grew up in Massachusetts, so I know a lot about Massachusetts in particular. I'm not familiar with up here as much, but just because of where I grew up. But in Massachusetts, we have praying towns, which is where they would take Mashpee Wampanoag people, so just Wampanoag is what they were known as, but they would take them and they would cut their hair, change their name, and they'd have to live in these secluded praying towns, and they weren't allowed to marry into English society with the Puritans living there, and we had King Philip's War. We had a lot of tribes siding with the English too. Like, so when we first had contact, it was the Nauset, and they were all wiped out, which is where the story of Thanksgiving with what's the guy's name? I can't think of his name. He was Nauset. He was the last surviving one. He spoke English, so he was able to communicate between them, and we just had mostly like people in Rhode Island, native peoples in Rhode Island, those tribes.
The Narragansetts.
Narragansett. They were against everything. The Wampanoag basically sided with the English, so we had that going on between intertribal.
You have many of these. I mean,
Fights.
I was in Connecticut.
Wars.
Over summer, and I had the chance to visit the Pequot
The Pequot
museum
were big.
and the full tribe, and today they own
were
their
huge.
casino. It was a huge tribe, and what shocked me was that tribe faced one of the earliest genocides ever
Yeah,
known, and we do not know about it.
Yeah.
And it is a consequence of the Christian.
They basically pinpointed us against each other.
Absolutely, they
Yeah.
brought the Iroquois from New York,
'Cause
the
they-
Narragansetts from Rhode
They
Island.
figured out the
tribal
pre-existing
alliances.
conflicts.
Absolutely.
And they
And I actually have it right here. It was in 1638, and they called the Articles of Agreement, and it was between the English and the Allied Indians, as they were called, and it was called the Treaty of Hartford. And that treaty stated that, again, in 1638, and divides the Pequot after they killed almost all of the tribe, whatever was left. They divided the Pequot between their members between the Narragansetts and the Mohegans. I'm sorry, it wasn't the Iroquois, it was the Mohegans and the Narragansetts. So they just split the Pequots in half, give half to the Mohegans, half to the Narragansetts, and then they were not allowed to be called Pequots. Like, they had to take the name. They were either Narragansetts or Mohegans. So we have a systematic erase of their history, their culture, and who they are.
right in
But do you know the land where the casino is?
in Connecticut.
The Foxwoods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was only one family on that reservation. That was the reservation.
Mm-hmm.
It-
And there was only one family
It
left.
still is.
Right. But their mother called her sons home and said, "We have to do something or we're going to lose this land," because her sons were not on the land.
Mm.
And that's when they decided to do the casino. And
Absolutely.
course. yeah, it's Foxwoods, right?
It's the focus
Yeah.
of Casino,
Yeah,
yeah, and the
exactly.
museum it's right next to it, and it's an
Yeah.
incredible
So
job
what
on
they've
it.
done is unbelievable.
It is unbelievable. It's like it's flourishing, and I'm really happy for that because, again, we're giving all these examples, some treaties, what happened to the Acadians, and I'm hope to talk about it more after this, but we see all these examples, and you just see like just how much religion has to do with it. And I think we as a team picked this topic, Christian, specifically discovery and domination, specifically Christian, because
I just wanna-
that's the motive, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to point out something interesting too, because not only with the English rule of, mainly I'm talking about the Maritimes, but because there was French people there as well, obviously, but the English people were even prejudiced against like Scottish people or Irish people that were there. Like, I have my grandfather, he was on my mom's side, talking about how he knew Gaelic, and they were told not to speak Gaelic in schools, just like the native kids couldn't speak their languages in schools. So
Absolutely, yeah.
they just hated anyone that wasn't English,
I think
and that's an interesting point.
it is a very interesting point. It's like you have to be English and not Catholic, I guess.
Right.
I
You have
think
to
that's
be
how-
English and like Christian, and that's it.
Well,
That's all you can be.
Protestant, you mean?
You gotta
Yeah,
be
Protestant.
white Anglo-Saxon
Yeah, I was
Protestant.
gonna say Protestant, but I didn't know if that was right.
Yeah.
Anglo-Saxon, yeah. I think that's the right one.
But you know,
Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah.
Governor Winthrop was a really early governor of Massachusetts.
Mhm.
He says that the natives were inhuman like the Irish.
Yep.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's really funny. He
Isn't that
compares the
incredible?
both. Wow.
Isn't that incredible? But of course, that was before there was any real Irish immigration into America.
Yeah.
It was
True.
long before that.
Yeah.
And it's kind of ironic that so many Irish would end up in Boston.
Yeah.
But because that, yeah, exactly.
I think it's
Incredible.
It was his
karmic
colony.
screw you.
Yeah. But the thing too about the residential schools is these poor kids are in the school and their culture is being taken away from them, and they become kind of a no man's land, because when they go home they can't speak the native languages
Right.
like their parents and grandparents could. They don't know the customs because it's kind of been hardwired out of them,
Brainwash.
and
almost.
so they're in between, and they don't have a sense of belonging anywhere,
A
Right.
clear
which is-
identity.
which
They
is
were-
horrible.
Right. They were so shamed. I have a story in my family where it was my grandfather on my dad's side. That's my native side. And I think he was telling my dad one time that when you weren't allowed to speak your language, his mom was speaking to him in Mi'kmaq, and they were out in public, and he had said, stop speaking that to me because it hurts my tongue when you do that. It hurts my tongue to speak my language.
Wow.
So it was like a psychological, like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's how it starts, and that's how you lose like identity and belonging, and that's why today there's just so much knowledge lost.
I think this is one of those events that started the timeline of stuff like this happening. Like in the West, later on in the future, even today, you can see trends like this happening. It's like, I don't mean to be political, but certain presidential candidates, they're very. I don't want to get too. political on the
Yeah,
show.
don't get too
You know.
political. We are
It's
not
just
biased show.
You can see the still trend. You can see the trend starting to either reform or carry on.
Well, to be honest with you, there is a trend and it's reforming because right now in Massachusetts, people don't know we're in a very critical state where I don't know if not a lot of people heard about it because it didn't get a lot of like clout, but we could have lost our land and are still in the process of retaking it because they don't want another casino, and it was from the current administration.
I mean, it still happens,
Won't
and
name
I
names,
mean,
but
I think what we should have called this episode was the Anglo-Saxon influence in New England.
yeah.
Definitely.
Pretty much.
But again, I want to reiterate with the language thing, it's interesting because I'm pretty sure French people, and I know Gaelic speaking, it's not as big, but Gaelic speaking people in the Maritimes in Canada also suffered the same thing. You probably have stories of French people not being...
In Maine, there were language laws.
Right.
In 1919, the Ku Klux Klan had a lot of
Right.
people in the Maine legislature, and they said that anyone who spoke a foreign tongue in Maine wasn't allowed to speak it in school.
Right.
Which again,
And so it was mainly aimed at the French
Mhm.
and the natives, but also the Portuguese and any ethnicity in Maine. They could not speak their native tongue on the school grounds. They could only speak it in a language class, like
Yeah.
French people couldn't speak French on the school grounds, but they could only speak French in the French class, and which was also Parisian French, to make it as different as they could, to make them feel as inferior
Exactly.
as possible,
Which
Yeah.
is why Quebec
to make
is
them
so...
want to forget it, and it worked.
Yep.
It worked
Yeah.
because
I bet it did, yeah.
the language is eroding all the time, and with Gaelic, the Irish, of course, have held on to Gaelic pretty well, but they say that
Scots have
the
too.
greatest
Yeah.
the greatest thing to preserve the Gaelic language is English suppression.
It was a sign of rebellion of you can't
Absolutely.
take this away from us.
absolutely. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I would like to get back to the Acadians and focus more on that, because I believe that you'll be able to give us more on that side as well. But at this point, we would like to thank WUPI 92.1 FM for hosting our podcast, and we wanted to let you know that WUPI is now available on TuneIn, and we also highly encourage you to like the page on Facebook and Instagram. Also,
Recommend you to
we
follow our podcast on SoundCloud by simply searching History Our Podcast. So we are back, and I think we kind of touched a lot of topics in a very short amount of time, but I'm really glad we did all of that.
Agreed.
So
That was fun.
And again, I think the title of our episode should have been the Anglo-Saxon influence in the United States, but we'll keep the broad
All right.
perspective on it.
I was gonna say, do you want to vote to change, but
But you could do that another time.
I can
too.
absolutely do
Yeah,
that.
because there's more than
whole
enough
other-
material there.
Yeah.
There's a fair amount of material on that.
Just a little.
But
Just
this
a
is the
little.
history hour, not the history century.
I mean, it could be, but
So I really want to go on this local problem, I guess, problem that people faced in this area, and that was because you have so much in just one state. You have the Acadians, which I really want to get on it, and you also have all the native population and what they faced, and we talked about it. And I think we forgot to mention when we talked about the houses and when the native kids were taken away, that wasn't particularly really far back. It was even, I believe, the 70s.
Yeah.
It was very recent.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of stories still. I mean, we have even today we have missing murdered Indigenous women.
Absolutely,
still
yeah.
a
So
thing,
I don't
still
want
occurring.
I don't want our audience to think that was really back in time. That was really recent.
It's recent. It's
Definitely.
still
It
happening.
started back in time, but it continued.
Absolutely.
yeah.
Until So let's get on the Acadian topic on that. How would you like to tackle that? Like, what was the biggest thing with the Acadians and the Anglo-Saxon change that brought that there?
Well, in the St. John Valley, the Acadians arrived here in 1785. So we are the earliest Europeans in Aroostook County. And of course, the St. John River had been known since 1612. They had mapped, Champlain had mapped, used with native help, a route between Nova Scotia and Quebec in order to carry mail and that kind of thing, get messages back and forth. And they went right up the St. John River. And they had all kinds of clever ways of being able to canoe up the river, because it was a tough canoe up the river. They could go up the Meduxaqueg River in Holton, and to get into the headwaters of the Aroostook River, and then go north on the Aroostook River, or get over on the Allagash Waterway to go north that way. There are all kinds of clever ways to do it, but they knew these river systems extremely well, because in the wars between the English and the French in New England, the native, who were the French allies, knew all the river systems, and they could attack any place in New England from the north, because there are all these river systems running into the St. John River system, and then it doubles back down and goes to the Bay of Fundy. But there are other river systems going into the St. Lawrence. And of course you have the mountains in Vermont and in Maine, in New Hampshire, where the river systems are flowing towards the Atlantic Ocean. So all you have to do is come in the back door in these
And go
these
up.
rivers, and then go over the mountains, and then go down the rivers and surprise these settlers.
I think they called it the highway too, right?
That's what it
the
was.
St. John, yeah.
Well, I mean, any river was a highway then.
But that was like the main, like the big one.
Yeah, because there were no other highways. It was just the river.
Mm-hmm.
It was just the river, and they used boats, and of course in the winter it's snowshoes, and that kind of thing. But that alliance was really really important. Now the reason why the Acadians in Aroostook County settled up in the St. John Valley first was because there was a native tribe there in Edmundston. They called it Madawaska, or Madwaskak, and Madawaska is derived from that. But they knew wherever there was a native village that there would be a Catholic missionary priest coming through fairly regularly. And there was only one priest in all of the maritime provinces, because they were outlawed in the maritime provinces. But they would come in from Quebec, and so the little parish in St. Basile, which is right across from St. David, Maine, part of Madawaska, that little parish is the mother parish of all the Catholic churches in the region, all the way down to Old Town.
Wow.
Benedicta, Holton, yeah, the church in Frenchville, in Van Buren, and in Holton were all founded around the same time. And of course in Holton you have the Irish population that was settling there, and that's in the 1820s, in the late 1820s, that's happening, and so you had that kind of dynamic going on. So for the French, we were isolated from the English, and managed to stay isolated until the coming of the railroads. And that was at the very end of the 19th century. The railroads don't get into the valley until the 1890s, 1910s. And it was the most prosperous time in the valley. All of the churches of the St. John Valley were rebuilt in that like 20 years. And there were sawmills in every town. And Van Buren was the largest town around. Because it sorted all the lumber that came through the Allagash region. It was all going down to Fredericton and St. John, New Brunswick, and it was sorted in Van Buren. And they had 4 large sawmills. One of them was the largest sawmill east of the Mississippi, and the railroad Bangor and Aroostook Railroad is taking a lot of that lumber out and taking it to other parts of Maine, and that kind of thing. So it was a real dynamic time. And in Van Buren, there was the Canadian Pacific Railroad, the Canadian National Railroad, there was the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad, all came together there. And then there was another railroad that was supposed to come from Campbellton, and they were going to get goods from Liverpool, England, going to Campbellton and taking the railroad and crossing the border. Did you know there was the U.S. consulate in St. Leonard, New Brunswick, right across from Van Buren? And there's a whole room in the National Archives of the records of that consulate.
Wow.
Yeah, and a lot of this was happening in the 1920s when there was a lot of rum running going on and that kind of thing. It was quite a dynamic time.
So, and again, that was kind of like, that was because of the first migration, of course, and you have the taking a cultural peoples from one land, and we don't exactly know about the full story in this episode, but the Acadian story goes that, they were taken away, they were deported in different places in the United States, and that's...
that there's a different story for every family.
Absolutely.
Because they had all these different destinations. Families were broken up. Because in the beginning of the deportation, the men and boys were loaded onto one boat, and they were not allowed off. So the women and girls were on other boats. And they were all headed to different destinations. So families were broken up. There was one family that had 160 members, and only 5 remained together.
Wow.
That is a big one.
Yeah. Well,
And
it was an extended family, but it still was
Yeah.
one family. Now, the people that end up in the St. John Valley are not the ones that were deported. They're the ones that escaped deportation and lived with the Maliseets along the St. John River, and stayed at the Maliseet village of St. Anne, right near Fredericton, right near Mactaquac Dam, and they were there, and then when the American Revolution is over and the United States has been created, loyalists from the United States, people who were still loyal to the British Crown, were given land in New Brunswick. New Brunswick became a colony, and they were given the land that the Acadians were on down in the Fredericton area.
So they kicked them again.
They kicked them again. But by then they knew that there was no way they were going to be part of France again. So they might as well play the game. And so they asked the king for land in the Madawaska area, knowing it was above Grand Falls, that it was beyond, they could be more isolated there. And knowing it was also contested land with Massachusetts. Massachusetts was claiming a lot more land. And if Britain could exercise sovereignty in the region by having citizens in the region, because Maine didn't have any in the region at the time in the 1780s, then Britain could claim that land, because the problem was in these peace treaties, in the Treaty of Paris in 1763 and another one in 1783, they used the same language, and the language divided Nova Scotia from Massachusetts, because New Brunswick was part of Nova Scotia, Maine was part of Massachusetts. And it just said there was this line that went in a northeasterly direction to the headwaters or to the mountains that acted as a divide between river systems, like a continental divide. And they talked about the highlands, but there aren't any highlands.
No one agreed on what was.
Exactly. And so they really didn't know the geography was the problem. And the British realized that they had been caught with their pants down, because they had agreed to language where the Americans could claim territory that would cut off their mail between eastern Canada and western Canada. So that was the reason why they had to really establish an Acadian settlement in the St. John Valley. And the thinking was that if they lost it, they're just miserable French. That's exactly the terms that they said. And in the Aroostook War, when Andrew Jackson was having to make a decision about whether he was going to go to war in order to maintain the claim to Rivière-du-Loup, which is almost right on the St. Lawrence River, he said, "I'm not going to fight over a wasteland," because it was just trees. And North America was full of trees.
Lumber, that thing for ships.
I mean, we
right, but but there was so much lumber everywhere that there was nothing special about it.
It wasn't anything to chase on. But I mean, we had our episode previously on Aroostook War, and we kind of talked about that border dispute. But I think what we should focus today about is the you have a totally new culture created just because of that deportation. Like the Acadians were never the same, I believe, after that.
No,
because even up to the 80s now, they would keep silenced. I mean, I don't think the schools now teach French.
they do. Oh yeah, they do.
They changed, of course. Yeah, but
they've always taught French in school as a foreign language, but the kids were not allowed to speak it on the school grounds.
Exactly, and I think that changed now, because I think there is a movement now to bring that back, bring that culture back again,
as much as possible. But the biggest enemy of that kind of thing is complacency. And so when you don't feel, because the French have done well, and when you don't feel oppressed, you don't feel as inclined to save the old ways.
True, yeah.
And so that's part of the problem. So how do you deal with that?
And once it's gone, it's not there.
Yeah, once it's gone, and it's just revival.
It's not completely there. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's just revival. And so to hold on to some of these traditions is difficult. Some traditions will skip generations, like with the natives with canoe making.
Yeah.
And the Acadians did the same thing. They learned the canoe making from the natives, and they made canoes. But you might only need to make a canoe every other generation, because they were very sturdy. They lasted a long time. So you didn't necessarily teach your son how to make a canoe. You taught your grandson how to make a canoe. And so these things, and we find even today in snowshoe making and things like that, it's tending to skip generations, except where there's real tenacity to keep it in a direct line, like the Theriot family up in Eagle Lake, real stubborn about making sure that snowshoe making hits every generation. And so that's alive and well still. But there are a lot of traditions that have gone by the wayside, and it has more to do with how everyone is distracted now by technology.
Right.
Absolutely.
In lots of ways. But you can always blame. There's always something to blame.
True.
There's always something that you can blame. And technology is a very good one to blame right now, because people are so distracted by it.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah. Well, we have 10 minutes, and we started from the Doctrine of Christian Discovery to the natives, and we ended up in
Now we're
Aroostook
here.
County again. I think this is the trend with all of our episodes. We start somewhere.
world bigger picture, and then we always end up back in the county.
We end up here.
Take a journey across the nation.
Well, that's because everything's interconnected.
That is true.
Yeah.
And it's hard to isolate a topic without talking about other topics.
And you can also bring local topics into a bigger image. And to recap, I guess, how, as a team now, as the history team here, how do we personally connect the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination? Because I think it's very important to think of that. How do we connect that idea with our state, with our neighborhood, with what's happening around us?
That's a broad question, Evan.
That is a broad question, but it has an answer.
I see that as
Every question has an answer.
I see that as the pin on the grenade, almost. These events, that's what the first thing that activated this long chain of events that happened, not just in communities, just across the country, maybe even the world in some places. It's things like this that kind of start off that massive scale of events that just kind of grow.
Absolutely, yeah. And we are where we are now.
I was gonna
Well,
say,
you know,
like a lot of like we have like global warming or climate change. A lot of that kind of thing is bringing forth like, I feel like a lot of reconciliation with like, I don't know, in Indian country we see a lot of that with push for that kind of thing, like paying more attention to your history and trying not to repeat it. I think that's something. I mean, I know we talked about technology earlier being more of a corruptive thing, but I think in a way sometimes if you use it the right way, it can help
be very
bridge the
beneficial.
gap. You know
Yeah,
what
yeah,
I mean?
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think it's important because topics like this, very broad, like the discovery, the domination and stuff, you start with that, and then once you follow on that, and I think that's where history falls here. Once you follow the steps and you put the puzzle together, it all makes sense and where you are today.
Yeah,
on
what
that.
I'm getting from this is like it's like a with all these like little events, the roots of the tree, and then the main issue, and then all the other issues just spreading out from it. you know?
Absolutely.
It's the little kids now that are going to decide what goes on, what's going to happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
So any last thoughts, any last words on the topic?
Remember your history, folks.
Yeah, don't let history repeat itself.
That's
Please.
Well, the problem is history does repeat itself all the time.
Unfortunately.
And history teachers
but-
cry.
That's a
News.
perfect
Come
way.
on.
Because we've been teaching this for 50 years and people haven't been listening. Or they've been
Nobody
half
listens.
listening.
Basically, like teaching the same thing over and over and over and over again.
Expecting different results.
Yeah.
The
That's the
definition,
definition
of
of sanity.
insanity.
Yay.
So, well, that's all for today's episode of the History Hour, and thank you for listening, and thank you to Professor Don Cyr
Thank you.
for joining us today and sharing his knowledge about this very complex, broad, but very important topic in American history. Join us again next week when we talk about the only lynching in New England, the story of Jim Cullen. And make sure you tune in to WUPI 92.1 FM next Saturday at 4 p.m. so you never miss an episode. Also, for previous or future episodes of the History Hour podcast, make sure you search and like our History Hour podcast page on SoundCloud. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thanks, guys.
Have a good one.